Hey guys, welcome to the video. My name's Carmen and today we are moving on to the next episode in our mini series on seam finishes. So last week we talked about flat fell seams, so I will link that video up there somewhere for you guys if you want to check that out. And today we're talking about sewing a Hong Kong seam, which in my opinion is probably the absolute prettiest seam finish out there, especially if you use a contrasting fabric, because each side of the seam allowance is encased in a bias strip. So if you use a contrasting fabric for the bias strip, it can look super pretty. And I really like this finish for things like jackets that you're going to see the inside of. So if you don't want to line your jacket, you can use a Hong Kong finish, and then when your jacket flips open, you can see the pretty contrasting fabric in the seam. So let's get started with the tutorial. Okay, so I've got my two pieces of fabric here and some pins, and I'm going to sew these two pieces of fabric together with the Hong Kong seam. So here I'm just showing you the right and wrong sides of the fabric, and I'm going to line them up along the edge I want to sew with the right sides together, so the outside or the prettier side of the fabric should be touching, and then I'm pinning right along that edge to hold everything in place, and then I'm gonna just sew that seam. Okay, so here I've got my fabric that I just pinned, and like I said, I'm going to sew it right sides together with my entire seam allowance. So for this 1/2 inch seam allowance, and I'm just going to sew that entire seam, and then we're going to take this to the iron. Okay, so now I've got this at the ironing board. It should look something like this, and I'm just going to iron the seam allowance open. So I'm ironing it open, and I really do like to iron the seam allowance from both sides of the fabric, just because I feel like it gets a nicer, crisper look, and I just like how I just think it looks a little bit better when you iron it from both sides. And then we are going to grab some bias tape, and this is about 1¼ inch wide, and it's not the double fold bias tape that you sometimes see at the store. You can also buy this. I made this bias strip, but making bias tape is another tutorial for another day. So you can buy this kind of bias tape, or you can make it. So I'm going to line up the right side of the bias tape with the right side of one of my seam allowance edges, and I'm just going to pin it to the seam allowance, but just make sure that you're only pinning it to the seam allowance, not to the main fabric. So I'm pulling up the seam allowance there to make sure that the pin only goes through the seam allowance. So once I get this pinned, then we're just going to sew the bias tape to the edge of the seam allowance, making sure that we're not catching any of the outer fabric in our seam. So that's what it looks like from the underside. You can see I didn't pin the main fabric at all, just through the seam allowance. Okay, so we're back at the sewing machine, and we're going to sew the bias strip to the seam allowance. So you'll want to fold the main fabric out of the way to make sure that you're only going through the bias tape and the seam allowance. And I'm sewing this about 1/4 inch from the edges. And once you get this sewn together, then you can trim down the edge of your seam allowance there to about 1/8 of an inch. And then we'll be going back to the ironing board again. Alright, so now it looks like this, and I'm going to fold along that seam we just sewed. I'm going to fold the bias strip out so that the right side is facing up towards you, and then iron that seam so that it's nice and flat, and I'm trying to make sure that small the small eighth or quarter of an inch seam allowance there on um, is folding out towards the bias tape, so that's why I'm doing this, turning it like this so that I can make sure that the seam allowance is pressed towards the bias tape. Then I'm going to fold the bias tape under and make sure that the edge of the bias tape goes just beyond the seam that you just sewed, and iron that down so it's nice and flat. And then you're going to grab some pins and pin the bias tape in place, making sure it goes beyond the seam that you just sewed, and making sure that your pins, once again, are only going through the seam allowance there. We don't want to get any stitching or pinning through our main fabric. And this is basically going to encase the raw edges inside of this strip of bias tape and give us this nice contrasting bias tape right on the edge of our seam allowance. So then now we're going to take this back to the sewing machine and we're going to stitch in the ditch. So basically stitching within that seam that you just sewed so that you can't see your line of stitching. So we're headed back to the sewing machine now. Alright, we're back in the sewing machine, and now, like I said, we're going to stitch in the ditch. So basically, this is the most challenging part of doing a Hong Kong finish, but basically you're going to try to stitch right inside that seam there, and that way you will not be able to see your stitching from the outside of the seam allowance. So just take it slow. I like to turn down my speed of my sewing machine down to the lowest setting, and I take it slow and try to just be as careful as possible to get within that seam there to hide my stitching. And that should catch the fabric on the underside, and that'll encase the raw edges of your seam allowance within that bias strip. So once you get that done, you're basically just going to repeat the whole process with the other side of the seam allowance so that they match. Alright, and once you've repeated on the other side, this is what it looks like. So isn't that just so pretty? And you can't see any of the stitching on the top side of the seam allowance. So if you have an unlined jacket that you are planning on sewing in the near future, I hope you'll give this technique a try. And I hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you in the next one.